This is Rich, and I'm going to be talking to you about a new subject today. But again, if you could just, as you're listening to this, if you like it, just hit subscribe and share it. I would appreciate it. Today, I'm going to talk about something that, it's going to be about employer and employee relationships. This is something you may not even think as being coming under the title of something that is about the gospel. And when you look into the scriptures, you'll find there's quite a bit in the scriptures about how employees should handle themselves in the environment of their employer or their boss. Most people today, when you're thinking about employment, most people are thinking of the day they're going to retire. And people have different attitudes and different goals as in their working years. Some people are looking forward to retirement so they can stop working and do what they want. Other people everybody looks forward to retirement, I'm assuming. Other people identify themselves in their work, and therefore when they do retire, they many times don't know what to do with themselves because their whole life is their work. Then there are other people that who go to work, and they like work, they enjoy it, but when they retire, they're ready for retirement. Now, I want to say in the scripture, though, it never talks about retirement. And so, as I mentioned, retirement, that's a thing in the U.S. and probably in other countries as well. But when you look in the Bible, there's nothing mentioned about retiring. We know that people did leave the workforce, and they would quit working because they weren't able to physically. So they were like forced into retirement or doing something that wasn't so physical. And other people do not want to work. And that was true during the first generation church, and it's true yet today. There are people who do not want to work. They want other people to work and pay for them and pay for a salary that they get for not working. I'm going to talk about that at the end of these sessions, just briefly. But we have that going on in the United States. People would rather live under entitlements. They feel like if they don't have to work, the government's going to write them a paycheck every month. Why should I work? So I'll address that in a little bit. Now, as Christians, we must associate work with the gospel of Jesus Christ, because work is something that's involved in and necessary for Christians. When we mustn't disassociate as a Christian and the workplace. If we do that, then what happens is the whole time you spend working, you don't see what part that has to play in your Christian walk. And it has a very big part to play, because as a believer and a working believer, there's a lot of hours spent per day in the workforce. And so does that mean that God is not involved in that? Absolutely not. God's involved in your work. God's got things He's doing in your work. And we as Christians, as believers, we must identify, okay, what is God doing in my job? What's He doing in the workplace? Is He actually up to something? Is He doing something in my life as a believer at the workplace? And to disassociate God from the workplace, you're actually practicing hypocrisy. And this is why a lot of Christians, they live a certain way on Sunday, but then during the week they live entirely differently. And they've learned that, but that's not the Bible. That's hypocrisy. That's not living the Christian life day in and day out, every day of your life. So the workplace is a fertile environment for where God can do the things He wants to do in your life. So please do not, as a believer, do not disconnect yourself from God in your workplace. He's meant to be involved in that. As we work day in and day out, if we keep our eyes on the Lord and we really realize that the Lord is working in my life, even at work, what happens is that affects our attitudes. It affects the way we work. And people will take notice of that. And what happens, it should happen over a period of time in your work, People are going to be drawn to you. People are going to have questions they want to ask you because they see you handling situations differently. They see you staying in a place of peace. They see the words and the actions that come, the words that come out of your mouth and the actions that come from you are going to be different from a person who's not a believer. Because you realize as a believer, you're under the authority of Christ even at the workplace. And that makes you different. That makes you stand out. And that will draw your co-workers to you, and they may ask you questions. In my lifetime, I've had lots of different jobs. I've been a teacher. I taught for many years. I was also a construction worker, but that was before I met the Lord. I was also a salesman. Now I was a salesman, a pastor. I pumped gas at gas stations and a truck stop. I painted, and I also had my own business. All of those I did while I was a believer. The last thing I did was have a business, and then when I retired from the business, I now am doing the Lord's work, you could say as a pastor, I guess, again, 100%. Because I am retired and I have all the time I have. Because I'm retired, I have time to devote to the things of God, and I devote a lot of hours out of my week to the work of God, because that's what's really important to me. So as a worker, when you realize you are a believer and you're working under Christ, you're under His authority at work, this will cause you probably to have conversations with people. When Jesus is at the top of the list, when He's in your top priority, it doesn't matter what you're doing. And since I'm talking about work, even at the workplace, you're going to find conversations, if Jesus is number one, conversations always lead to talking about Jesus with people at the workplace. The conversations will go that way because, again, like I said, they see you being different. They see you reacting to things differently. They see you they see your attitudes when certain decisions are handed down from the boss or bosses, and they see you responding to these things differently than what most people do. So it causes them to be drawn to you and want to ask you questions why you act and why you work the way you do. And you can tell them that you're under the authority of Christ and you're working for Him. I was to just kind of clarify this, I was in a situation, this was many years ago, when I was teaching. At the end of the teaching day, I had to go pick up some college classes. And so I was traveling with 4 other people, all of us in the same car, and we were on the road at least an hour there and an hour back. And in this ride with these other teachers, there was 1 woman and 4 guys, and there was lots of coarse joking, a lot of cussing, using the F word. And quite honestly, the lady that was there was the worst out of everybody. And here's again, as a believer, and Jesus is number one in your life, you can't participate in that kind of stuff. And so I sat there in silence for a long time, back and forth, for 2 hours. One day out of the week, 2 hours at the end of the day, we were riding. And all this cussing and joking is going on, and I didn't participate in it. I just sat there, and I just sat in silence. Finally, one of the other guys riding along said, "Rich, I've noticed that you don't laugh, you don't respond to what we're talking about." And what are you going to say to that? I said, while we're riding back and forth, I said, all the stuff that you guys are saying, I said, it just grieves me so much. Because you're talking about a person that I love so much, and His name is Jesus. You keep using His name in vain and using it as a cuss word all the time, and I don't appreciate it. And that's why I don't laugh at your jokes, because you're using His name. And whoa, you talk about it getting quiet. And I didn't say this to upset them. A guy asked me why I wasn't laughing, and I'm not going to lie to him. I just told him straightforward. And it changed the whole disposition of the people in that car. And shortly thereafter, one of the guys in the car asked what it was to be a Christian. So I went ahead and explained to them what a Christian was. But he seemed to be a little bit curious. The rest of them didn't seem that way. But, it's hard to read the heart of a person. But this person spoke up. And he went in the mix with everybody. He wanted to know what a Christian was. So I told him what a Christian was. And I don't know what happened to all of them. We finished out our going to classes, and it just, but all the cussing, the joking, and the using the F word all stopped. And we just went back to normal conversation, which is what I was hoping for. So that's the kind of effect as a believer you have on coworkers when you're in the working environment, because people that don't belong to Christ are going to be doing things that you wouldn't think about doing. You may know about it, but you've stopped participating in that lifestyle, and now all of a sudden you got people living out this lifestyle that maybe you once lived in, but now you don't, and you know it's wrong to participate in that lifestyle. So what happens? Your attention is drawn to you, but they see you at peace. They see you doing your job. They see you keeping your attitude right, and so on. So people eventually will be drawn to you, and they'll begin to ask you, they may start to ask you about your belief system. Now, I want to talk about this, and going through this on employer-employee relationships. I want to talk about something that's extremely important. It goes through the whole fabric of this subject, and that is authority. How does authority fit into this? Where does authority fit into this employer-employee relationship? Well, we know that authority is involved in about everything. It's involved in civil things. It's involved in marriages, government, schools, commerce, and so on. And so it's also involved in the workplace. Now I want to read to you a very familiar verse. This is in Romans 13, verses 1 through 5, and this has to deal with authority. We have to understand that authority is involved in this relationship between the employer and employee. That's the first thing we must catch. It says, everyone must submit to governing authorities, for all authority, I'm emphasizing all authority, comes from God, and those in the position of authority have been placed there by who? By God. Now what does that mean exactly? Well, that means in the workplace, your boss, your boss's boss, and so on, were placed there by God, whether they are believers or not. And God's placed them there, and they have authority. So we, as employees, need to recognize that. So anyone who rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and they will be punished. For the authorities do not strike fear in people who are doing right, but in those who are doing wrong. Would you like to live without fear of authorities? Do what is right then, and they will honor you. The authorities are God's servants, sent for your good. But if you're doing wrong, of course you should be afraid, for they have the power to punish you. They are God's servants, sent for the very purpose of punishing those who do not do what is wrong, to punish who do what is wrong. So you must submit to them, not only to avoid punishment, to keep a clear conscience. So is authority in the business place? Yes, it is. It's, it doesn't matter where you work. Unless you're the boss, you're going to be under authority in that workplace. Now, if you're the boss and you own your own business, and if you're a believer, you're still under authority. You're under the authority of Christ. And more than likely, you probably work under a franchise or something like that, or with a company, but there's probably somebody over you, a person that also has authority over you as well. So all of us must learn to walk in a place of being under authority. There are benefits that come to us from that. So again, as believers, we are under authority in the workplace, and we're there to, and the people that are in authority are there to make the business work efficiently and turn a profit. That's what a business is. Hopefully the ones that are working there in that business, hopefully they'll catch the vision of what that business is about, and they'll want to work there, and they'll work to make the business prosperous. Because as the business prospers, then most of the time, not always, but most of the time, the person who's leading, who has the business, will want to pass down some of the benefits, the blessings of the business prospering to the workers. I know that. I used to have a business, and my son has a business, and you'd pass on those benefits to the workers because you don't want to lose them. You want them to keep working for you, because after you put time and you've trained them, you don't want them to leave. So you try to give them raises as much as you can. You try to have certain savings accounts, investments, and so on. Maybe help pay for some of their hospital insurance and those sorts of things. Those are all benefits to help people stay at the workplace. So it's important as an employee we catch the vision of that person's business. We can help them prosper because in a lot of cases, we end up benefiting from it as well. All right, and so what we don't want to do is we're working at a particular place and there's corruption going on. Now, a lot of businesses, there is corruption. And so when that's going on, then we may have to make the decision whether we leave or not. Now, let me just say this. As an employee, and if you're in a place where there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of backstabbing, whatever it may be, then you have to, as a believer, you have to pray and seek the Lord to see if it's your time to leave. Do not just break away from a place and leave it because you don't like it. You want to make sure you're doing what God wants you to do. Remember, where you work, you're under the authority of Christ in that workplace. You're under the authority of your boss, but you're also under the authority of Christ. And so you have to find out, does the Lord want you to leave that workplace, even though there's corruption there? That's something you have to determine. Don't leave in a huff. Don't leave with your emotions all out of whack. Or don't leave in anger because somebody did or said something to you. No, you need to settle down. You need to pray and ask the Father, am I to leave this place and go look someplace else? And the answer may be yes. But on the other token, you may stay. Well, if you're going to stay there, then we have to make sure that we keep our attitudes right, and we have a proper respect and honoring towards the boss. Now, again, the boss may be somebody that's corrupt. He may be an evil person, but that doesn't mean that we can treat them and talk about them any way we want. We are not to do that. Now, what we don't want to get is in an environment, a bad thing can happen. We can fall into a situation, in a trap, and start bad-mouthing our boss. We don't want to do that. We don't want to have a negative attitude towards any of those that have authority over us. Why? Because if we do, we are nullifying the power of the gospel to work in that place. And that's not going to help us. So we must, and also remember, even if you're working in an environment that's corrupt, what we have to see is there's a higher authority than your boss, and that's Jesus Christ. As a believer, Jesus is your final authority. So if that be the case, then what is Jesus doing even in a corrupt place? He's maturing you. I guarantee you that he's maturing you. And always remember, in your mature, if you stay there, you're going to mature. You will be repaid by the Lord himself by working there in many ways. Just learn to identify them. Now, let's say you're employed by an unbeliever, or maybe you're employed by a believer who's not walking, or maybe you are employed by a believer who is walking. 3 scenarios: unbeliever, a believer who's not walking, and a believer who is walking. Do any of these situations change? Any of these things change for you as an employee? No, they don't. Whether the people over you are believers or unbelievers, or believers who are not walking with the Lord, have nothing to do with you as an employee, as far as you having the right attitude and so on. We practice the same thing as employees, no matter what status the employer is. Whether he's a believer or an unbeliever, doesn't make any difference to us. We still come under that person's authority, but again, we come under the authority of Christ. So we're still working for Christ. And in that process, we still should be honoring, even if it's a corrupt unbeliever, we still need to honor that person and respect that person. Now, we have to do that because we do not realize the effect as a believer, as an employee, we will have on that place of business. We don't really know the impact as a believer that we'll have on other employees and the employer and our bosses as well. Let us not cut short what the Lord can do in a place of work through us. We are there with a purpose. Anytime you're working someplace, realize that God has placed you there with a purpose. And He has big plans in mind for you working there. It's safe to assume that one of the main reasons you're working someplace is if you're keeping your attitude right and you respect and honor your bosses and you speak well of them and you work hard at it, it's safe to assume that the Holy Spirit's going to be opening up avenues in that place for you to talk to people about Jesus. Now, if you get stopped, and this happened to me one time when I was teaching, I had students in my class that were asking me questions because I'm a teacher and I was a believing teacher. They started asking me questions about my faith. And so I started telling them about my faith, and I brought in books and put it on a table, and so they could pick up the books and take them home. And the kids had a lot of questions. Well, eventually what happened, what I was doing got back to one of my kids' parent, who was a principal, I think. And they got a hold of my superintendent, and my superintendent told me, he said, "You cannot be talking about religion in the class," which I didn't realize that. And so I stopped it, and I took the books off the table and so on. But if somebody came up to them and they still wanted more, I could talk to them after school. And it's the same way at the workplace. You don't want to let talking about the Lord disrupt your work, because that affects your pay and so on, and your relationship with your boss. But there's always time after work. You can talk with people if your boss doesn't want you talking about Christianity on the floor or where you're working. So just talk to them afterwards. Always remember this: as a worker, you are a worker of the King of Kings, of Jesus Christ. He is busy. He's involved in what you're doing at your workplace. He's doing things there with you, and He's preparing people in the workplace for you to talk to them. Again, it may be after work, but there is going to be a furtherance of the kingdom of God in that place because you're there. Now, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to start again. I'm going to have probably two more lessons on this, and I'll be starting on the next session about authority. Thank you very much.